By noon, the bank had put a bright silver chain across the only gate Jonah Bell had left. Not one gate. The only one. 87 acres of dry pasture, a sagging barn, an old pump house, and the house his wife had painted twice with the same pale yellow because she said changing colors was how people give up on a place. Now there was a foreclosure notice stapled to the post. A deputy standing nearby. A banker in city shoes trying not to get mud on the cuffs of his pants. And Jonah, 67 years old, hat pulled low, saying absolutely nothing. The banker clicked the padlock shut, tugged it once for show, then looked at Jonah and said, almost casually, "If you cross that chain, Mr. Bell, that becomes a legal problem too." Jonah didn't answer. He just stared past the man. Past the gate. Past the notice. All the way out to the west hollow, where a crooked little pump house sat half hidden in dead grass. And the strange part? He didn't look beaten. He looked like he was counting. That evening, after the trucks were gone and the deputy's tire marks had dried in the dirt, Jonah came back. Alone. No flashlight. No hurry. He stopped at the bank's new lock for a second, then walked right past it, straight toward the old pump house. Reached into his wallet. Pulled out a flat brass key so worn it looked almost smooth, and opened a different lock. One nobody had touched in nearly 30 years. That's the moment this story really starts. Because the bank thought it had sealed Jonah Bell's last farm. What it had actually done was force him to open the one thing he'd been trying not to touch. And by the time the auction date arrived, the men who came to bury him were the same men trying to shake his hand. But to understand why, you have to understand Jonah. He wasn't the kind of man people noticed until they needed something heavy lifted or something stubborn fixed. He lived alone after May died. 3 winters now. He still set out 2 mugs some mornings. Still bought the cheap mint candies she liked, even though he never ate them. Still folded bills in half, then in half again, and tucked them into the left pocket of his shirt. Like cash could somehow be made safer by being smaller. He had hands that looked carved instead of grown. Knuckles like walnut knots. A slow way of moving that made impatient people think he was weak. He wasn't weak. He was careful. There's a difference. Every morning, even after the bank notices started coming, he woke at 4:50 without an alarm. Fed the border collie first. Boiled water for coffee in the dented kettle May refused to replace. Stepped onto the porch and stood there long enough to listen. That was his thing. Listening. To wind direction. To boards settling. To the pump line when it clicked wrong. To silence, too. Especially silence. Because if you live on land long enough, silence tells you when something's off. And for the last year, silence had been getting expensive. First, the rain missed them. Then feed prices climbed. Then the tractor transmission went. Then Jonah refinanced one note to protect another, the kind of decision that sounds temporary when a banker says it across a polished desk. After that, it became a staircase. 1 payment late. Then 2. Then letters with language that felt written for someone else's life. He had already lost the North Field 3 years earlier. Sold the equipment shed lot the year after May's hospital bills came due. Then the Creekside parcel went in, a tax settlement. He never talked about. By the time the bank chained that gate, this wasn't one farm among several. This was the last one. The last Bell property not sold, split, or swallowed. The last ground his father had walked. The last porch May had sat on with her knees wrapped in a blanket even in September. Which is why people in town noticed when Jonah didn't fight. At least not the way they expected. He didn't yell. Didn't call the bank crooks in the parking lot. Didn't gather neighbors or make speeches. He just watched. That bothered people more. Because when a man loses everything and stays quiet, you start wondering what he knows. Or what he's planning. At the grain store, they said he was done. At Nora's Diner, they said the place would probably go to that development group from Cedar Ridge. The one that had been buying acreage along the highway. Solar, storage, distribution, something like that. Nobody knew for sure. But two things were obvious. They wanted land fast. And they wanted Jonah's land badly. That part had started months before the foreclosure. At first, it was polite. A clean pickup. A man named Trevor Dane, with white teeth, and a watch too expensive for a farm road. He stood at Jonah's porch, holding a brochure with fake green trees printed on it, and said, "We're making fair offers before the market changes." Jonah looked at the brochure, then at Trevor's shoes, then at the sky. "What market?" he asked. Trevor smiled like a man used to people folding under that tone. "This whole corridor will look different in 2 years." Jonah sipped his coffee. "Then come back in 2 years." Trevor laughed like it was a joke. It wasn't. After that, the offers kept coming. 180,000. Then 210. Then 240, contingent on quick close. For a place the bank later described in court paperwork as distressed agricultural collateral of limited commercial utility. That phrase got repeated around town because it sounded insulting even to people who didn't understand finance. Limited commercial utility. Funny way to describe land people kept trying to buy. Jonah kept saying no. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just no. The real pressure started when the bank changed hands. The local branch manager who knew his father retired. In her place came a regional asset officer named Grant Holloway. 42. Pressed shirts. Perfect hair. The kind of smile that never fully reached his eyes because it spent too much energy managing the room. Grant didn't talk to Jonah like a farmer. He talked to him like a file. He'd sit in that office tapping the edge of a yellow folder and say things like, "Let's be rational." Or, "You need to think of land as an asset, not an heirloom." Once, Jonah took off his glasses, cleaned them slowly with a handkerchief, and said, "Funny, you need land to make assets. Never seen it happen the other way around." Grant smiled. Made a note. That was their rhythm. One man speaking numbers. The other speaking in a language numbers came from. Jonah's daughter, Ellie, begged him to sell. She wasn't cruel. She was scared. She drove a school bus, raised 2 boys, and knew exactly how close her father had come to losing everything before. She'd sit at his kitchen table, rubbing the rim of her coffee cup with her thumb, and say, "Dad, this doesn't have to end like some point you prove." "It's not a point," Jonah said. "Then what is it?" And every time, he'd glance toward the west window, toward the hollow, toward that bent little pump house. Then he'd say the same thing. "Not yet." That answer drove her crazy. Not yet what? Not yet sell? Not yet explain? Not yet give up? He never said. And that's where the mystery lived. Because Jonah Bell was not a gambler. He didn't bet on weather. He didn't borrow against hope. He didn't even buy appliances without sleeping on it. So when a man like that keeps refusing money, he clearly needs something is buried underneath the refusal. Maybe not in the ground, but somewhere. The first clue came from May. Not directly. From memory. A week after the foreclosure notice, Ellie was helping clear kitchen drawers when she found a flour tin full of old receipts, seed tags, 2 church bulletins, and a photograph of Jonah at maybe 12 years old standing beside his father in front of the pump house. On the back, in May's handwriting, were 6 words. Ask him about the West Hollow. Ellie sat there for a second, reading it twice. Then she drove straight to the farm. Jonah was on the porch fixing a torn screen with the patience of a man doing surgery. She held up the photo. What's in the West Hollow? He didn't even look up. Grass. Dad. A pump house. Mom wrote this. That made him stop. Just for a second. One thumb pressed against the screen wire. Wind moving the loose edge. The dog watching from under the truck. Then he looked at the photo, and something changed in his face. Not fear. Something older, like a door inside him had shifted. She told you to ask? She wrote it! Jonah nodded once. Went back to the screen. Then I guess May figured this day might come. Ellie waited. He said nothing. She took a breath. You're going to lose the farm. Maybe. Stop saying things like that. He kept working. Dad, what is in the West Hollow? Finally, he set the screen aside. Your granddad used to say there are 2 kinds of value on a farm. The kind a stranger can see from the road, and the kind he hopes you forgot. Ellie stared at him. That means nothing. It wasn't supposed to yet. And that was all she got. A week later, the bank posted the chain. A bright new lock on old iron. They chose midday on purpose. People could see. Humiliation works better with sunlight. Grant Holloway came in person with 2 men and a deputy who looked uncomfortable the entire time. Trevor Dane's truck was parked down the road, just far enough to pretend coincidence. That detail mattered. Jonah noticed it. So did the deputy. Grant handed over the final possession notice and said, in that polished voice, there will be a public sale in 10 days, unless the balance is cured. Jonah unfolded the paper, looked at the amount, $78,412 plus fees. Not $1 million. Not some giant movie debt. Just enough to destroy a man who didn't have it by Friday. Grant glanced toward the house. You've had multiple opportunities to resolve this. Jonah looked up. And you've had multiple reasons to want it. Grant's smile flickered. Want what? The land. We want the note satisfied. Then why's the buyer always parked half a mile back? For the first time, Grant didn't have an easy response. Trevor stayed in the truck. The deputy looked away. And Jonah, standing there with foreclosure papers in one hand, noticed something else. Grant kept checking his watch. Not because he had somewhere to be. Because he was anxious. Like a man waiting for a thing to finish before someone else got involved. That afternoon, Jonah did something he hadn't done in years. He drove to the county records office. Not to argue. Not to beg. To look. He signed the ledger with his careful block handwriting and asked for 3 files. The Bell property survey from 1979. the irrigation district maps, and archived transfer certificates from before the district digitized records. The clerk, an older woman named Denise, who remembered May's peach jam at church fairs, raised an eyebrow. Digging? Trying to remember something my father never explained properly. Denise gave him a look that mixed sympathy and curiosity. Those are usually the things worth explaining. He stayed there 4 hours. No lunch. No phone calls. Just maps spread under his hands, finger following boundaries, parcel notes, easement marks, old stamps fading red at the edges. At one point, he leaned back so suddenly, his chair squeaked. Denise looked up. "You all right?" Jonah stared at a notation in the margin of an irrigation transfer. He smiled. Not big. Not triumphant. Just enough to make Denise set down her pen. "I might be," he said. That night, he went to the pump house. That's the lock he opened. Not the bank's lock at the gate. The old brass one under 3 coats of paint on the pump house door. The key had lived in his wallet so long it left a green outline in the leather. May once asked why he carried it if the pump house hadn't worked in years. He told her, "Because one day someone's going to act like they know this place better than we do." She laughed, then apparently wrote herself a reminder. Inside the pump house, it smelled like mineral dust and old wood. The electric motor was dead. The switch box hung crooked. Cobwebs across the pressure tank. Nothing dramatic. Nothing glowing. Just an abandoned structure full of forgotten farm things. Unless you knew where to kneel. Jonah crouched by the back wall, reached under the lower shelf, and felt for a nail head sunk into the board. Pulled once. A thin panel loosened. Behind it was a metal cash box wrapped in wax cloth. He lifted it out slowly, like it might wake something. Took it outside. Set it on an overturned bucket. Opened it. Inside were 4 items. A bundle of folded paper tied with baling twine. A brass tag key marked D17. 3 original irrigation share certificates. And a letter from 1984 with the district seal still intact. Jonah read everything twice. Then once more. Not because he didn't understand. Because after all these years, he finally did. His father had separated the water rights. Legally. Quietly. Decades earlier, during a drought cycle so bad cattle were being sold by the pound just to keep feed bought for the rest. The land had been used as collateral over the years. The buildings, too. But not all of the senior water. A portion of the oldest district shares, rare pre-expansion priority rights, had been retained under a separate family conveyance and never bundled into the later mortgage renewals. Most people didn't know that because most people, including the bank, were reading the land file, not the district archive. And in a dry county, old water can be worth more than beautiful dirt. Suddenly, Trevor's offers made sense. So did Grant's hurry. Someone had either guessed or discovered that the West Hollow still controlled access to Ditch 17, and with those shares attached, the property wasn't distressed collateral. It was leverage. The next morning, Jonah made 3 calls. 1 to Denise at the county office. 1 to a retired attorney named Sam Keeler, who had handled farm transfers before his stroke slowed him down, but not his mind. And 1 to Miguel Serrano, who ran a large vegetable operation 20 miles south and had been short on water allocations for 2 consecutive summers. Miguel came out that evening. No polished shoes. No brochure. Just dust on his truck and a legal pad on the seat. Jonah showed him the certificates at the kitchen table. Miguel didn't touch them at first. Just leaned in. Then sat back and whistled softly. Where'd these disappear to? Jonah gave a tired little shrug. My father hated explaining things before they were needed. Miguel nodded like that made perfect sense. Because on farms, it does. They talked until midnight. Not about selling the whole place. About leasing a portion of the water allocation. Temporarily. Enough to cure the debt. Enough to keep the land. Enough to stop the wolves without inviting new ones. Miguel made an offer. Jonah didn't accept right away. Of course he didn't. He asked for sleep. Asked Sam Keeler to review the paperwork. Asked Denise to confirm district priority. Then asked one more question. No one expected. If I do this, can they still force the auction before funds clear? Sam took off his glasses. No, not if tender is made in time and in full. Jonah nodded. Good. But he still wasn't smiling. Because money wasn't the only problem now. Timing was... Word got out faster than it should have. Maybe from the district office. Maybe from Trevor's side. Maybe from Grant trying to get ahead of it. Whatever the reason, pressure turned ugly. Trevor came back with a final purchase offer. $300,000. Cash. Signed that day. Jonah listened from the porch swing without inviting him to sit. Trevor leaned on the railing like they were old friends. You're not set up to move that water cleanly in time. Jonah chewed one mint candy and said nothing. Trevor lowered his voice. You could take this deal, solve the debt, pocket the rest, and leave with dignity. That word landed wrong. Dignity. As if selling under pressure was something Trevor got to define. Jonah looked out toward the hollow. You know what my wife used to say? Trevor smiled politely. What's that? She said men get real respectful right before they try to take something. The smile thinned. Mr. Bell, markets don't wait for sentiment. Jonah stood up slowly. Good thing water does. Trevor left without another word. 2 days before the auction, someone cut the small chain on the pump house door. Not the gate. The pump house. That told Jonah everything. They didn't want the land. Not really. They wanted what the land controlled. He replaced the chain that night and sat in his truck until 2 a.m. with the dog asleep beside him and a thermos gone cold. The next morning, Grant called. Voice too smooth. We've heard you may be attempting a last-minute asset transfer. Jonah said. Heard from who? A pause. Then, I'm advising you not to complicate this. Jonah looked at the fields, pale under wind. You already complicated it when you locked my gate before the sale. That was a possession protection measure. No, Jonah said quietly. That was theater. Grant's voice hardened. If funds are not received by 10 a.m. Friday, the auction proceeds. Jonah checked the clock on the stove. 8:14. Then I'd suggest you keep your morning open. Friday came cold and bright. Auction days always seem to... People arrived early because public ruin draws a crowd, even when folks pretend they're only there out of concern. 2 pickups from neighboring farms. A couple from town. Trevor in a camel coat, looking annoyed by dust. Grant holding a folder and talking low with the auction clerk. Deputy Raines beside the gate. And the chain still there. The same bright lock catching sunlight. Jonah wasn't on the porch. Wasn't by the barn. Wasn't visible at all. By 9:47, Trevor checked his phone 3 times. By 9:52, Grant started scanning the road. By 9:56, people began whispering that maybe Jonah had finally broken. Maybe he stayed home. Maybe pride had run out. Then at 9:58, a dusty Ford came over the rise. Jonah driving. Sam Keeler in the passenger seat, stiff-backed in an old suit. And Miguel behind them in his own truck. Jonah parked. Got out slowly. No speech. No dramatic music. Just boots on gravel. He walked first, not to the bank. Not to the crowd. To the chained gate. Everyone watched. Even the wind seemed to stop for a second. Deputy Raines stepped forward. Jonah. But Jonah lifted a hand, polite as ever. Reached into his pocket. Pulled out a small ring of keys. Not the brass one from the pump house. Another one. A plain steel key. He slid it into the brand new padlock the bank had snapped on his gate 4 days earlier. Clicked it open. Just like that. Grant's face changed. What are you doing? Jonah removed the lock and handed it to the deputy. Taking down something put up before its time. Grant stepped forward, color rising in his neck. That property is under active foreclosure control. Sam Keeler opened his briefcase. No, Mr. Holloway, it is under scheduled sale pending default. Distinctly different. He held up paperwork. Also, my client is here before deadline, with certified funds to cure the arrears in full, including fees, as itemized in your own notice. The crowd went still. Trevor looked at Grant. Grant looked at the papers. Then at Jonah. Then at Miguel. And in that tiny stretch of silence, everybody understood there had been another game running underneath the one they were shown. Grant took the envelope with stiff fingers. You can't possibly have liquidated this that fast. Jonah looked at him for a long second. You'd be surprised what still has value when people stop reading. Only the obvious file. Trevor stepped in. This is about the water, isn't it? Jonah turned to him. First real smile of the morning. Small. Tired. Sharp. This is about you offering me $180 for something you already knew wasn't worth $180. Trevor said nothing. Because there was nothing safe to say. Sam Keeler spoke clearly so the whole crowd could hear. Senior district shares attached to Bell Family Conveyance, partially leased through lawful transfer this morning at district office. Debt cured before sale, auction invalid. The auction clerk lowered his clipboard. A woman near the back whispered, Water rights. Another man muttered, Lord. Grant flipped through the paperwork faster now, trying to find a hole. There wasn't one. Denise had stamped what needed stamping. The district had signed what needed signing. Miguel had wired what needed wiring. And Jonah Bell, the man everyone thought was too slow, too old, too late, had done the hardest thing in the world under pressure. Not panic. Think. Trevor tried one last move. So what now, Jonah? You save it for a year? 2? Then what? Jonah looked past him, through the gate, toward the house, toward May's porch, toward the hollow his father kept hidden in paperwork and silence. Then he said, Then I farm what's mine. Not louder, not meaner. Just final. Grant handed the cured note. Acknowledgement to Sam, like the paper itself, had turned hot. Deputy Raines cleared his throat and stepped back from the entrance. The crowd began drifting into smaller conversations. disappointment mixing with admiration the way it always does when people come for an ending and get a reversal instead. Trevor stayed put a moment longer. You could have sold and saved yourself trouble. Jonah nodded once. Could have. Trevor glanced at the fields. At your age, why keep fighting for this? Jonah's eyes moved to the yellow house, then down to the dog waiting by the truck, then to Ellie's boys standing beside their mother near the fence, watching him like they were seeing him clearly for the first time in months. He answered without looking back. Because not everything you keep is for you. That line traveled around town for weeks. People repeated it in feed stores, in church parking lots, and over pie at Nora's. But the part they missed, the part that mattered most, was what happened after. Jonah didn't become some instant legend with a new truck and a victory grin. He didn't cash out and disappear. He used the water lease carefully, paid the debt, fixed the south fence, repaired the porch step Ellie had nearly gone through twice, replanted a smaller field instead of trying to run everything at once. He even sold off 2 broken implements he'd been meaning to fix since the Clinton administration. That's how real victories look usually. Not glamorous. Just breathing room where there used to be panic. Ellie came by more often after that. One evening, she found him at the kitchen table retaping the old photograph of him and his father. She sat down. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Jonah took his time answering. Because that was his way. Tell you what. Any of it. He rubbed a thumb over the edge of the photo. Because if I told you too early, it would have sounded like hope. She frowned. And that's bad? When money gets tight, hope makes people sloppy. He met her eyes. I needed facts first. Ellie sat with that a second, then laughed softly, almost in spite of herself. That is the most you thing I've ever heard. He smiled. Probably. She looked at the photo again. Granddad really hid all that in a pump house? He didn't hide it, Jonah said. He put it where only someone who cared enough to stay would ever find it. That was the lesson, really. Not that Jonah outsmarted the bank. Though he did. Not that greedy men got embarrassed in public. Though they did, it was something quieter than that. A place can hold value nobody sees, because value isn't always what shines first. Sometimes it's the old record, the ugly building, the thing people dismiss because it doesn't photograph well. Sometimes it's one sentence your father said when you were too young to understand it. Sometimes it's a key in a wallet for 30 years. And sometimes the people trying hardest to rush you are the ones most afraid of what happens if you get another day to think. A month later, Grant Holloway was reassigned. That's the polite version. Trevor's company bought acreage farther east, where the water wasn't as strong and the owners weren't as patient. Jonah never talked much about either of them again. He wasn't built for victory laps. He was built for mornings, for fences, for weather, for listening. That first spring after the auction was canceled, rain finally came. Not a miracle, just a decent rain. Enough to darken the soil and pull a smell from the ground Jonah hadn't breathed deeply in years. He stood at the edge of the West Hollow with the dog beside him and watched the runoff move toward Ditch 17. Slow, steady, still there. Ellie's youngest boy ran up and asked if the farm was safe now. Jonah looked at the ditch, then the barn, then the little pump house leaning in the grass like an old man with one good secret left. As safe as anything is, he said. Then he added, after a pause, safe enough to plant. And maybe that's the strongest ending a story like this can have. Not revenge, not riches, not applause, just a man keeping hold of what mattered long enough to put seed back in the ground. Because the truth is, people will always underestimate quiet men. They mistake silence for surrender, patience for weakness, age for irrelevance. They see worn jackets, old trucks, unpaid notes, and assume the story is already over. But sometimes the quietest person in the room is the only one who remembers where the real value was buried. The bank sealed Jonah Bell's last farm. They brought a chain, a notice, a deadline. They thought power looked like possession. They thought if they stood at the gate, the story belonged to them. It didn't. Because while they were busy locking what everyone could see, Jonah was walking toward what they had missed. One old door. One hidden box. One set of papers. One decision made calmly under pressure. And that changed everything. So if you ever find yourself being rushed, cornered, or talked down to by someone acting like your only choice is the one they're offering, slow down. Look again. Read the forgotten file. Check the ugly building. Ask why they want it so badly. There may be a lock in your life that isn't there to keep you out. It may be there to remind you there's still something worth opening. And sometimes the comeback doesn't start when you fight. Sometimes it starts when you finally understand what you've been holding the whole time. Would you have taken the first offer and walked away? Or waited one more day to find out what the land was really worth?